again, if you read the preface, right, you'll see that it's a seriously ambitious book. In fact, just yesterday, Amitabh Kant tweeted, like, saying that he finished reading the whole book and that it's a must read for every civil servant. So I think, see, what is unique about the book is that it reflects, a combination of deep academic research, right? I mean, into kind of fundamentals of governance and fundamentals of how the Indian state actually works. You see, so because a lot of writing by economists focuses on what the government should do without focusing on how can it do it and can it even do it, right? I mean, so there's this old saying in India that the problem is implementation and not policy. But frankly, if the policy maker is not paying attention to implementation constraints, then it is not a good policy, correct? Like, I mean, and so part of the issue and the larger arc of the book is to say that the common pattern I have seen in my work across 20 years. See, I'm basically a public finance and development economist, right? So my focus is on improving effectiveness of public policy, public expenditure to maximize development outcomes, correct? So that's kind of been my focus. Now, the reason why I started the book is that I've worked in education for almost 20 years, okay? I have worked in health for over 10 years. I've worked on welfare programs, NREGA, PDS, all of that for about 15 years. I worked in early childhood and the more sector, and I've worked in almost every state in India, right? So over the years, I had started doing a nationwide study on teacher and doctor absenteeism in the public sector. I had done in 2003, so 20 years ago is when I started my journey of doing deep field work and figuring out how kind of government works at the grassroots level. Right? So the point is that as I was reflecting on all of this work, it becomes very clear that the common binding constraint to our development is the governance challenge and not that of the sectoral issues. You see, so all of our discussions happen at the sectoral level. Okay, what should we do in primary education? What should we do in primary health? What should we do in early childhood education? But if you look at, say, early childhood education as a simple document, for 20 years, we have been talking about this. Okay, so we passed the constitutional amendment, 86 constitutional amendment was passed saying we will do preschool education. Then 2009, RTE has it. Then 2013, there's an ECC framework. 2020, NEP has it. But for 20 years, people have been arguing that we need more capacity in the Anganwadi system. Okay, and so what I did in Tamil Nadu was we did this large-scale randomized evaluation where you just look at the impact of putting one extra Anganwadi worker focused on early childhood education. And what you see is stunning positive effects on education, on child nutrition, and we estimate that the return on investment is about 20 times higher. Okay, so that's one example of saying that it is not enough to think about policy. You really have to go down to the grassroots and saying what is the constraint and translating that policy into impact. And that is where the binding constraint to India's development is that we have not really invested in the state itself. Now, I think the other nuance
is state, you mean the government system? By state, you mean the state governments?
I mean a bit of both, correct? Like, I mean, so I'm using the state in the sense of the state as in the government, but it is also true that I'm focusing on state government level issues because 90% of these issues are constitutionally with the state government, correct? So basically service delivery functions, primary education, primary health, Anganwadis, they're all with the state government, correct? So there are centrally sponsored schemes, but constitutionally these are state government responsibility, right? So there is a pun on the word state, right? So the state applies to both kind of the idea of the state and the state. So, but yeah, so I think, so intellectually, if I was to locate the book, it would be saying, see, for 50 years, I'm guessing you're from Kerala, so, you must be aware of, these different, development models, right? So Bhagwati versus Sen debate in terms of growth versus development. The grand debate in development has been, should the growth walas, correct? So Bhagwati and Panagariya will say that in the long run, growth is the most important thing. And so if you manage to get faster economic growth, everything else will follow. So every outcome is correlated with growth. Now, on the other hand, what Amartya Sen and Jean Drèze will say is that the purpose of development is not income. The purpose of development is to improve human capabilities and human life. And therefore, things like health and education and social sector should be a priority. And they will focus on Kerala to say, listen, Kerala versus US. US is 15 times richer, but Kerala has comparable human development. Correct? Now, what is my point of departure in this debate is to say that this, at some level, they're both correct, okay? Because more growth helps human development, more human development helps growth, right? So what are we fighting about? It becomes a fight about what is the sequence? And so the growth walas will say we need to do capital expenditure, infrastructure, and, focus on productivity. The development walas will say we need to focus on the social sector. Now, my point of departure in the book is to say that this fight is fundamentally a fight of budget allocation. But if you look at how inefficient inefficient the government is in converting our budget to outcome, then it doesn't matter what you're spending on, you're spending it very badly. So the return on investment of improving public systems and what I call quality of expenditure is going to be 10 times more than just spending more money on the sector. So that is, I think, intellectually the most important point of the book, right? Which is to say that, and this is what I think T.V. Somanathan, who's the finance secretary, like, I mean, in his endorsement, that's what he says, right? He says that this is one of the most important points in the book.
You say that the delivery system is somehow flawed. And how exactly can this be rectified? We presently have a present government which says that we have carried over that situation by using digital as a means of the last mile delivery. Now, how true or how effective has this been? And where do you differ on that? Or where do you agree with that? Would you say that this is the way forward?
If you look at the history of the modern nation state, okay, and this is in chapter 2, it has evolved over phases where what I call a security state that focused only on defense and law and order. In the 19th century, you started building an industrial state where the state government would build roads, railroads, infrastructure, to support productivity. And then it is only in the last 100 years, okay, that you have built the modern welfare state. The welfare state is actually remarkably recent. So even if you look at high income countries, the welfare state starts only after World War II, because it's in World War II that the countries have raised the tax capacity, like a need to fund the war. And then after the war, they use the taxes for the welfare. The modern welfare state is very, very recent. It starts after depression, so 100 years. So it starts after depression, but it really takes off after World War. But the other subtle point is that these three phases of the nation state, okay, are correlated with the amount of democracy, okay, because the security state has no democracy. The industrial state, which is the US and UK, these are places that have democracy but very limited democracy, okay. So the only people who have the vote are white property owning men. Okay, so if you think about that demographic, is the demographic that wants capex because they benefit from the appreciation in the land values. Whereas if I look at an income distribution, if you are left of the mean, you want redistribution. If you're right of the mean, you want low taxes. Okay, so this whole expansion of the welfare state happens only after universal democracy. Okay, so what makes India? Why am I giving you this context? Because what makes India unique in human history is that we are the only country with universal democracy on day one. Okay, so then what a democracy before development does, see, this is, some people say it is a mistake. I'm not calling it a mistake. I'm just saying it is a great moral triumph because it gives the marginalized citizens a voice in governance. Then at the same level of income, there was slavery and colonialism in the UK and the US. Okay, so it's a great moral triumph. But the problem is that expands the demands of the state before the state has the capacity to meet those demands, right? So because these other welfare states are happening after middle income status. So simple example, okay, one very powerful example. The US does food stamps for the poor, for food security, at a GDP per capita of $18,000, okay, like adjusted to 2011 dollars. India does PDS at a GDP per capita of $1,200. So at 1/15th the income of US, we are doing that. So it is a huge moral triumph. Okay, but what that means is that given the limited public finances, the use of the resources for the welfare programs at an early stage means that we have chronically underinvested in our governance systems, because the governance systems only pay off in the long term and not in the short term. So the political incentive, therefore, so these governance investments is always important but never urgent, okay, compared to coming up with a scheme that you can take to the voters and get credit for. So fundamentally, this is a completely non-partisan issue, right? I mean, across governments, we have underinvested. Now, to come to your second question. So, and I think this government, and I think the Prime Minister intuitively gets it, okay? So which is why I think one of the reasons for their popularity, frankly, is even though they have not expanded any of the major welfare schemes, I think philosophically they are doing what I'm advising in the book, okay? Which is to say, focus more on tightening and cleaning up delivery rather than on announcing new schemes. And I think they have managed to do that very well in welfare programs where you can disintermediate these layers, okay, because otherwise money would get stolen at every intermediate level, and there you go directly to citizens. I think they have done a fantastic job. Okay, now what is the unfinished agenda? The unfinished agenda is the service delivery that is mediated through humans. Okay, so if you look at education, if you look at health, you can't digitize away the intermediary, correct? And so that requires much deeper, sophisticated thinking on governance reform. So which is why the book is meant to be a completely non-partisan roadmap for the country.
Okay. And also, you spoke a lot about the central versus state thing. So I've mentioned one point where actually I've written decentralization is a panacea or a pain point. But I would rephrase it to ask you, we do have a present government which would like to centralize things more. It has been kind of encroaching into, there's been a narrative that's been built up that, even stuff that are taxes that are going to state kitty, like fuel, for example, or even alcohol and other stuff, which are the few domains where the state still taxes this thing, should be put into GST and all that. So this would mean whenever we have a very strong central government, these kind of sentiments always pop up. So how do you balance it out? What would be your suggestion for this center versus state thing?
I got a text, the other day from Monte Carlo, former Planning Commission deputy chairman, who had written one of the endorsements. But then he said recently he reread the federalism chapter, and he said the federalism chapter was one of the best he has ever read. Okay, so if you have a chance, it'll be good for you to read that chapter. See, the subtle point in the federalism chapter is that, too much of our discussion focuses on who has control, whereas the discussion should focus on what is good for citizens. It is not a blind thing of saying everything has to be decentralized more or everything has to be centralized more. Okay, it turns out that there are costs and benefits of both. Okay, and we have to balance. So what is the benefit of centralization? Sometimes is you get economies of scale, you get better national coordination. Okay, you get better and lower transaction costs, and it becomes, overall you can also get better expertise. Okay, in designing many things if it is done at the central level. But what is the cost? The cost is that when you over centralize, there are two fundamental costs. Okay, that you have to accommodate much more variation across the country with the same policy. Okay, so Kerala's needs are very different from Bihar, and the more you centralize, the more suboptimal your policy becomes for different regions. Okay, that is one problem. Second problem is frankly not about center to state, but state to local. Okay, the bigger over centralization in India is not from Delhi to state government. The bigger over centralization is from state to local. The reason I am not often very sympathetic to chief ministers who complain about over centralizing is they are the most guilty. So it is like Dr. Raja Challaiah famously said, everybody wants decentralization up to their level, okay, but nobody wants to then let go power below that. Okay, so I think the important point is, if you go back to first principles of federalism and look at what is in the citizens' interest, okay, there are functions that are optimally done at the government of India level. Okay, everything from defense to foreign affairs, but even in terms of some aspects of welfare programs where workers are migrating across states. Simple thing is, whenever people are migrating across states, it becomes something that the government of India should try to coordinate. Because simple thing, in the pandemic, right, we did not have PDS portability, but if we had PDS portability, then the migrant workers would not have to go back, because they would be equally catered to in whichever state they were in. Okay, but because the PDS benefits and NREGA benefits are not portable, so then they have to force to go back to avail those benefits. Okay, so there are some aspects of governance where we need more centralization, but there are other aspects where we need much less. Okay, so we need much more decentralization. So particularly accountability over schools and health clinics and local service delivery, right? So if you look at first principles of federalism, that should sit with the local community, because they are the people who can observe, is the teacher absent, is the teacher showing up. So what I have done, see, there is a historical reason why we are over centralized. Okay, it is not just that we are over centralized because somebody is grabbing power. Okay, the India is the most over centralized country in the world, but the reason is that the time of independence, for the founders, the biggest fear was that the country is going to break apart. Okay, so they over centralized power with government of India. Like Dr. Ambedkar deeply distrusted local elites. Okay, from implementing progressive policies, because there was a concern that local elites will not allow education of underprivileged groups, they will not allow gender rights, they will not allow. So the reason they've over centralized is because there was this Ambedkar Nehruvian vision of a modernizing state that will overcome the biases and prejudices of traditional society. So that is why they never trusted local government enough. Okay, but unfortunately 75, that has not really worked. Okay, so if you want effective service delivery, you have to decentralize more. But now the good news after 75 years of independence is people are a lot more educated and a lot more aware that they are able to resist, you see, if there is a too much local elite capture. So that's why on service delivery, we need a lot more decentralization. But the action is not so much center to state, but state to local. Okay, so that's why it's a subtle point, and it depends on what the specific topic is. In some, whether we need more decentralization, but overall, yes, on core service delivery functions, we definitely need to decentralize.
So my last question, Karthik, is like, now we have an election going on. So what do you think the incoming government should do differently?
Like Montek says in his endorsement, the 91 reforms were relatively easy because that meant getting the government out of things it should not do. Okay. But the next generation of reforms is making the government better at doing things it has to do. Okay. And the problem is, it's not just about money, it really is about public systems and public management. Correct. So this is a wicked problem. It's not an easy problem to crack. And that's why nobody takes it on, because it's important but not urgent and it seems too difficult. So what I'm doing here is I'm taking this incredibly difficult problem and trying to provide some structure around how to attack it. Okay, like I mean, and saying that the pillars of effective governance. So coming back to, so here's what I would do. Okay, what I would do is I would literally create a public systems strengthening mission. Okay, and I think Prime Minister has intuitively understood some of these things, which is why he's doing Mission Karma Yogi. Right, so Karma Yogi is a part of what I'm talking about in chapter 5, which is focusing on the capacity building. Okay, now eventually it has to get into better management, better postings, transfers, using data for all this and making it transparent. So, but I think the administrative reforms should be a top priority. I think working on institutional aspects like judiciary. The judiciary is very difficult because you have to manage it very delicately, because any intervention is seen as political control, right? So you have to be very clear that what you need is a judicial process reforms commission that is headed by a retired Supreme Court judge, to make it very clear that it is a process being driven by the justices. But the problem today is the High Court Chief Justices have an average tenure of 1 year, 1.5 years. So the people with the authority have no time or bandwidth, okay, to take on these kind of problems. So the basic issue is this: politicians know how to win elections and set priorities. Bureaucrats know how to design and run programs. But what we need is almost like a redesign of the state, okay? Like, and that's a design reboot. And that's why I've written this book, okay, to say that this is the deep reform agenda. Now, even if they act on some of these things, I would say the pillars would be, the other thing I would do, okay, is I would seriously, going back to what Prime Minister initially said in 2000, see, I would bring back the temperament of the PM in 2014-15, when he talked about cooperative federalism in a very deep way, okay, where you have to build trust with the states and you have to work in partnership with the states, because some of our most difficult problems require center-state collaboration, okay? They cannot be done just by center or just by state, okay? So we need kind of trust, and we need, a certain amount of central focus, but also some states will lead by themselves, and then a better sharing of best practices across states with a focus on governance reforms, would be the key. Now, of course, there are pillars such as better data measurement, better public finances, and all of that. But sectorally, I would say we need to fix education, we need to fix health, we need to fix these core sectors. But the way to do that is by improving quality of public expenditure and strengthening public systems.
And better center-state relations also.
Exactly.
Great. See, your book is not just insightful. I think it's very, very topical. The timing couldn't be, more perfect. So I hope whichever government is coming in, this should be like compulsory reading.